Hey everyone, welcome back. This is part two of the video series kind of discussing the EPICS project. And in this particular video for the e-learning lab, I'm just going to be discussing Django and how that works, and a little bit more about how things are organized and what considerations we might want to have when we're developing. And I think that will be it for this video. I'll discuss a little bit more about the particular aspects of our code and maybe even walk through an app of my choosing just to show you how things were built out or whatnot. But for now, I just want to discuss Django. And in this video, I won't particularly talk too much about HTML or CSS, Python even. Some other resources might be useful for that I'm sure you can find online. Always feel free to reach out to the team lead, whether that's me or whoever is the team lead at your moment in time. So without further ado, I just want to talk about Django. So I'm on the Django docs right now, djangoproject.com, and I'm just going to read out what they advertise themselves as. So Django is a high-level Python framework that encourages rapid development and clean, pragmatic design. Built by experienced developers, it takes much care of much of the hassle of web development, so you can focus on writing your app without needing to reinvent the wheel. It's free and open source. So there are some really great things about this framework, and it mentions these few things like it being fast, secure, and scalable. Those are good, but I think the greatest part is some of the pre-built-in features. So Django has, for instance, a authentication system already built in for your users. It has an admin panel so that you can essentially create your new objects on the back end from the admin's user interface, so that we don't have to build out specific forms or a specific area just for admins. Now, it's a little less flexible in some regards, but having those things already built in, including things like sessions already built in, so that we don't have to worry about handling web tokens, understanding when we need to expire them, when we need to refresh, and how we need to destroy these tokens to make sure that users can stay logged in for a specific period of time or be logged out or whatnot. So not having to handle all those things, and then other protections like cross-site request forgery, which is essentially just if you clicked on a link from, let's say, an email, and you had a login, so you had an account that would automatically log in. Some of those security issues and malicious intent, like for instance SQL injections or whatnot, are handled by Django. And that's just a little bit of background. In a little bit more depth, we see that Django follows the model view template format design pattern, and this is actually quite a bit different from MVC for those of you who have used model view controller. And this is a diagram that I found of kind of the interactions we have. So we'll start with the user who makes a request, and Django will determine if we have that URL, or it'll send a 404. And if it finds that URL is linked to a callback, essentially, and that is our view. So URL is linked with a specific view, and the view handles all the logic between the model and the template to generate the resulting HTML that will be rendered to the user. So it'll grab information from the models, the backend. So the models are technically connected to a backend as well, and that would be our database. So it'll use information from that model and map that through context into our templates and whatnot. So those will all come together, and it'll be returned to that URL for that user. So that is a little bit about the process. It's a little more complex than that, but this is just a simple way to think about that. So the models and templates are coming together for the view and servicing that URL. So now I just think I will go into more detail about the model, the templates, the views, URLs, maybe some forms, and not in some great detail. I think the Django documentation is really substantial, actually. They reworked it recently and have been making things better and better in terms of documentation. Obviously, there's some really great documentation out there that exceeds Django's, like Stripe or Heroku's is pretty decent as well. But mostly, everyone talks about Stripe as a really great um, source of API documentation. But Django is pretty good as well. I think I'll just point out some important things right now. Let me see if I can find the table of contents. Documentation, table of contents. Okay. So I would potentially go through some of this first stuff, like the install guide if you have trouble with that, maybe some of this Django at a glance. Um, it's not in too much depth though. You can go through this tutorial. I also have some better tutorials. Well, maybe not better, but other tutorials. But this explains some important things like removing hard-coded URLs and templates, namespaces, having some just an example kind of thing that you walk through as well. But I would probably, I'm not really going to focus on that. You can go through that tutorial if you desire. There are many different tutorials for Django that are great. So I think the most important stuff will be in using Django. So other than installing, talking about databases and models. So the things for this section I would focus on are the models and making queries in particular, and potentially, not, although it might not be that important, potentially aggregation managers. Um, Everything else I haven't used too much. Performing raw SQL queries I haven't done. It'd probably be more efficient in some cases, but unless you really want to look through them, I would just focus on the models and making queries. That would be the most important stuff for the models. Handling HTTP requests, writing views, of course, these shortcut functions, and then URL dispatcher, I believe. Uh, those would be good things to understand for your views. Working with forms, so it'd be good to have an understanding of basic HTML forms, and then you don't really need to have a great understanding of that. Django makes forms very easy, and I'll illustrate those. So I would maybe look into HTML forms, Django's role in it, forms in Django, building a form, and then potentially, yeah, I'd probably look through all of this to be honest. Maybe not this more about form classes or whatnot. I haven't gone through this section too in depth, but I think for sure HTML forms, roles, forms in Django, building a form, and working with form templates would be good. Templates, I would just look through the template language stuff. It's not too advanced for templates. It's mostly just HTML, CSS on the outside, and then the templating language just injects data from your context. Class-based views, I don't really use these, but you can look into them if you want. And they're pretty cool though. You can add mixins and whatnot. You can generate generic views, which are good if you need like a detail view or some sort of generic like list view of your information that you don't have to configure too much in depth through your view. But yeah, no need to really look through this class-based views unless you really want to. Migrations, maybe commands, workflow, and that's all really. Some of this stuff is more important if you're actually working with the production database and trying to perform tons of migrations or whatnot, and rolling back things and rolling forward things and whatnot. Managing files, no need to look in that really at this point in time. Testing, if you want to look into testing, we're not writing any tests in depth for our project. It's small scale enough that we can kind of manually test it. But if we want to be thorough and someone really wants to get more of a handle on testing, the testing framework seems pretty simple, and I would I would suggest looking into that if you're interested. Otherwise, not a big deal. User auth, not super important to look into. You might want to learn how to get the current user, how to check if they're a staff member, if they're authenticated or whatnot, and utilize those in your views. There's some decorators that can make this easier. Cache framework, not too important. That's a lot of stuff on the back end or behind the scenes that you don't really need to look into. All this stuff, not super important. I might be using this actually, this send email API this semester. No need to look into that. Pagination, I used that last semester. So this could be potentially good. So if you have a lot of data and you don't want to show it all at once, having a paginator is really good. Security, if you want to look into these cool different things that Django is protecting you against. I said cross-site request forgery is one, SQL injection, clickjacking, cross-site scripting protection, a whole bunch of these cool things that Django's built to handle. Performance and optimization, if you really get in depth on something and want to look into that, you can. No need to look into serialization too much. Settings, if you're interested, you can look into that. Signals, I think I actually used a signal to create data that was missing, but no need to look into that. That was a very specific use case. And other than that, maybe look into these how-to guides if you run across something that's very similar to these processes. Otherwise, I think that's all I really recommend from here. And without further ado, I'll just go back into our project and start talking a little bit more about these things in context. So first thing I'm going to do is talk about models. So each model is a Python class that subclasses this models.model module, or class rather. And a model is a single definitive source of information about your data. It contains the essential fields and behaviors of the data you're storing. Generally, each model maps to a single database table. And each attribute of this model represents a database field in that table. So there would be, for instance, I believe they're columns. Yeah, it would be a column called courses, column called title, column called created by, yada, yada, yada. And those would be our fields in that particular table. Now, the great thing about this is Django automatically gives us a database access API, and it also makes making queries very easy. I mentioned you should probably check out those making queries and whatnot earlier, so definitely do that. Make sure you're looking at these field types and field options in the docs, as well as maybe just looking throughout the code we already have. So for instance, these options max field or max length equals 200, having a unique title for every single discussion. We need to have, for instance, a course for our discussion. And if our course is deleted, we want all our discussions for that particular course to delete as well. We don't want random discussions just existing after the fact. And then you want things such as default fields in case something goes wrong. Or in particular, default fields are great when you're adding new fields. So although this doesn't really make great sense, let's say for instance you wanted to add color, a field called colors to this model. You could call it color equals models, let's just say a character field of a particular length. So the biggest issue with this is all the previously existing discussions aren't going to have that value filled in. So this can cause some big issues if we try to utilize that field within our project. And I think it might even, when you perform that migration, Django will probably throw an error at you or ask you to create one-off during that process. And rather than creating a one-off, which is simply, I guess, explicitly telling what every single value in the database should be set to, if it's not already has one, I believe creating that default handles that for you and will automatically create populate those fields that were previously existing. So let's say we just wanted the default to be white. If nothing else was picked already, we could set the default is the color white or the color blue or whatever. And that's all I really have to say about those field options. I would definitely look into all the field options and what are important and whatnot. If you have foreign keys, you're going to want some on delete action, whether that's cascading or I forget what the other ones are called really. I've only used cascade in most situations, maybe one other. I can't remember what it's called though. But having that information and what they're used for is very useful, especially if you're creating out the models for a particular application. Some other things that are important are having a better understanding of these methods. So what is this discussion defined as? It's if you look into it, it's just its title it's defines self as a string. Having a particular URL to return. So this returns the URL to a particular discussion HTML. So it would return the reverse, and reverse essentially gives you that URL in a way that you don't have to necessarily understand what direction you're coming to or what kind of arguments need to be passed in. There's some better explanations on the docs as well. This is a common error you get when you're rendering things in different places throughout the site. Not having a reverse lookup can be quite an issue. And the last thing, I don't know if I mentioned this, just understanding foreign keys and primary keys. Primary keys are auto-generated, but you can change those to have like UUIDs or having specific types of primary keys. And the last thing I want to say is to get our models into the program, the platform, we need to add it as an installed app. Just make sure we have those models connected. So in this case, it would be components.discussion board for that application. And I think that's it for models. I'll just talk a little bit about migrations. So when you create those changes in your model, you're going to want to create a migration to add that field to that table or remove that field or whatnot. And you need to be careful because I mentioned before, there can be some fields that need to have a value that don't currently have one. But you'll just be running, let's see if I can show you here this terminal. So in this terminal, we see we're in the application. So the best way to run migrations, you can run them for both a single app or you can run them for the whole project. I normally just run it for the whole project because you're usually only working on one app at a time, to be honest. So it'll only change that one app. So Python manage.py would be our script, and then the command is make migrations, and this is also on the README if you want to look into that. So if you perform this, it'll make those changes in the field, or it'll let you know if there's some sort of error. After you do that, you're going to do Python manage.py migrate. And this is for any application. This command will be the same regardless. So you do Python manage.py make migrations. If it all goes well, then you'll do the migrate. And you can also perform rollbacks through the migrate as well, I believe. And I believe that's all, really, for models. So moving on, I'll talk a bit about the views. It's going a little long, so I'm going to try to be cognizant of that. So for this view, I'm not going to go into great detail, but maybe I'll go to the URLs first, actually, because we access the views through the URL. So URLs. So there's our root config and our settings.py, and that is where all our URLs stem from, essentially. So we're going to go to URLs in the Virtual Learning Lab app. So if we go here, we can see all our URL patterns, which connect to all our other apps and all their essentially URLs that extend from the current spot. So for instance, in our discussion board, it'll add on student/discussion board. And then once you get to discussion board, there will be a URL mapping to the URL patterns there. See? And all these are the paths from discussion. And the way these are resolved is I believe Django goes through all the URLs in order. And once it finds that, it just returns immediately based off of that view. So yeah, it'll run through each URL pattern in order, and then once it finds that matching URL, Django will import and call that given view. So in this instance, if it found the discussion ID, it would call this view.discussions function, and it would render out the discussions. And all views, I guess I'm moving a little bit onto views, but they'll take in a request object, HTTP request, and it'll also take in any parameters that are needed to render that particular request. And these are keyword arguments, I believe. I could be wrong though with that name. And ultimately, if no URL pattern is found, so that means it went through every single URL that was specified in here and nothing was found, it'll return a 404 error, I believe. Or it'll return the appropriate error handling view. And the last thing I want to mention about URLs is it's important to have those reverses. And it's strongly desirable to avoid hard coding URLs. It just makes things simpler. And I'm not just going to talk about too much in reverses because I don't think I can explain it well. But if you change, for instance, if you change the URL in one place, you don't want to have to change it all over the site. So for instance, getting absolute URL in your models is really, really good practice. And then in your templates, rather than going to a particular like hard-coded URL, you can call the URL, let me see if I can find one, discussions. You can go to the URL for that name. So discussions here, that's the same name right here. So those will map. So if you change this URL, it will not affect like your template redirect, because it'll be based off of the name. And you might have to change if you change the parameters, but if you, for instance, if you put a whole bunch of different words before, for instance, if I put in hi/EPICS, so that wouldn't have any detrimental effect. I believe I explained that well. But yeah, just views, just for better clarity, are a Python function that takes a web request and returns a web response. So it'll take in a request and then at the end it'll return a response. And this is from the shortcuts, Django shortcuts. So those are really nice to use. So it'll return a response. And then in this case, I'm returning a response to this particular HTML based off of this context. And just the primary goal in a view is to get the information for this context, I feel. Unless you're handling a specific action. So almost like a REST API call. For instance, I have a delete comment one where we're not technically, I guess we are returning a response, but we're redirecting to the discussion, the get discussion URL. And the great thing about this is I don't even need to pass in any arguments other than the discussion itself. And that's because I have this discussion.get URL. And if you just put that in, it automatically sends you to the discussion detail for that specific value, and it'll grab the fields straight from straight from the object itself. So it'll grab it straight from the discussion you passed in, which is really convenient. And I mentioned for the shortcut functions in our views, redirect is a great one, render is a great one, get object or 404 is another great one to utilize. It just makes things simpler. The last thing before I get onto templates, I just want to talk a tiny bit about the forms. Sorry for this getting a bit long, but for this we see the great part, another great part of Django's system is forms are really easy to create. If you compare this to HTML forms, these are it's pretty function based, and the way the templates render them it's really simplistic, and it just makes it easy and simple. So for instance, in this discussion form, we have a model based on the discussion, and then we have specific fields we want to render out, and these forms extend the form model form, but you can see that it's pretty straightforward and pretty intuitive. So, and just to make this more clear, so when rendering, for instance, like a form in Django, we would get hold of that view based off of the URL that's requested, and then we would pass this to the template context. So right now I have discussion form as the template context, and then I'll pass it based off of this render function to render out that page, and it'll be expanded into HTML markup pretty automatically. So let me see if I can find a great place to illustrate this. So I think on my discussions page, I actually have this. So for instance, this is a really simple form. So the method is post. So I'm creating something. The action is to create new discussion. And this just renders out. So you need this CSRF token to prevent that cross-site request forgery stuff. And then I have a discussion form rendered just like that. So I don't need to style everything or whatnot. It's pretty much straight in there. And you can do a little bit of things in terms of how you render it. So you can render it as a paragraph, as probably a list. There's some things in the docs you can look into. I usually use the crispy forms, apply that filter or whatnot to style it. So that's about forms, and you can also style with CSS and JavaScript if you want, but excuse me. But that's a bit for the forms. Another thing I didn't mention is you can do error checking and validation as well. Widgets can be added. There's a lot of customability that is available. And then the last thing I'll be talking about is the templates. And templates are really pretty much HTML with some dynamic rendering. So Django needed a way to conveniently render HTML dynamically. And the most common approach that I've seen is just utilizing a template engine. And templates contain static parts of the HTML, as well as some special syntax to describe how the dynamic content will be inserted. So you can see, for instance, I have a loop for comments that were sent from the view via the context. And for each comment, we see that we're rendering out every single comment, and then we're rendering out information based on the fields of that comment. So if the comment is removed, we state that it's deleted. Otherwise, we check if it's made by staff, and then we add some options there. Otherwise, we render out the comment and whatnot. So definitely a lot of different conditional renderings that are available. And the template engine is already set up. So Django will look through all the templates, and once it's found, it'll stop looking through them. I think that is an adequate explanation of the model view template. Of course, look into the Django documentation and whatnot for more details and anything that will help you. Feel free to ask me or fellow members of your team or whoever the team lead is or whoever's familiar really, or go anywhere online to find more information that is probably more helpful for your specific situation. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back next video talking about our specific project in more detail than I did today.